Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video we're going to look at what is a repository. This is important because Git is organized in a very specific way to give you control and power. It's important to understand what Git is because all Git commands are used for one thing only. Git is a set of layers, and each layer sort of has a function. The function is dependent on the layer, but all you do with Git is you move files between these layers. And the layers provide error control, redundancy, and more things. So depending on the layer, you get one thing or another. Let's look at these layers. The first layer is your file system. The file system is just your computer, so all the files that you've got. Git isn't this layer essentially, but this is the layer that you've got before you use Git. Then you can choose to initialize Git in a specific folder. Say you create a folder and you want this folder to be a Git repository, you can initialize Git in it. Then you've got this folder with your Git repository in it, and say you create a file, such as a Python file. These changes that you've made to this file that you've created are not tracked by Git by default. You have to tell Git that you want to track this file. So what you do is you tell Git to include the files in the next snapshot. In this case, if it's only one file, then you'll just add that file to the staging area. You add the file to the next commit. If you then create more files, you can also add them to the staging area, and eventually you end up with a staging area that has a few files. The changes are still not tracked until you commit them. You create a snapshot of the files. So what you do is you commit the files to the local repository, and this creates a snapshot of them. For example, if you create a simple Flask application and you add it to the staging area and you commit it, that saves that file in its current status. If you then add more code, you will add it again to the staging area and commit it again, and the changes between version 1 and version 2 will be saved as a separate commit. And then as you do this more often, you will build up a history of versions of your file, where each version has some more code. This means that you can go back in time to a previous commit if you've, for example, made a mistake or you want to remove some code. Naturally, if your computer blows up, you lose your files because they are all in your computer. So the last thing to do is to host these snapshots, these commits, remotely. So you can push these files to the cloud and send them to a Git service like GitHub or Bitbucket. These are two separate services. A lot of people get confused with GitHub and Git. Git is the thing that allows you to move files between these layers and allows you to commit and push. GitHub is essentially just a server that hosts your Git repositories so that you have a Git repository in your computer, a local repository, and also a remote repository, a repository that is hosted in GitHub. You are not limited to using GitHub, so you could have a local repository, a remote repository in GitHub, and a remote repository in Bitbucket, so you can have two remote repositories, for example. What's important to remember is Git is the thing that allows you to do these things. GitHub is a server that hosts your repository for you. So each layer has a function, and it is optional to push your commits to a remote repository, although again, if your computer gets damaged and you have your commits in a remote repository, you can just download them again. So really it's helpful for redundancy and making sure you don't lose your data. And finally, the layers are all physical. It's not some sort of software magic. Git uses a folder called .git folder, and whenever you make a new commit, that commit gets created there and it stores the new snapshot and all those things, and when you push them to GitHub, all those snapshots get sent over and uploaded via your internet connection to GitHub's servers. So there's no magic going on here. All Git is doing is calculating the difference between your previous version and your current changes, and it's storing those new lines that you've added, those new code that you've added. And that's really all that Git is. is a way of storing snapshots. And it is really helpful because it means other people can see your snapshots and then they can collaborate with you and you can revert back to previous snapshots and you can host your snapshots on the cloud for redundancy. So really a great tool to use, and I've not worked in a team that hasn't used Git, so definitely something that you should learn. That's it for this video, and I'll see you in the very next one.